Perfect. All right, so let's get started, folks. Today with me, I have three awesome people who are going to be discussing the sharing economy. We may actually have one more individual join in, just having a little bit of technical difficulties with Google Hangouts, as you might have noticed from a little bit of a late start. But let's just start with some introductions. Adam of Cove, if you would be so kind, is to give us a little bit of background, and then we'll kind of just move to Adam, and then Steve.
Sure. So Adam Segal here, founder of Cove, which is your productive space in the neighborhood. It's an alternative to working from a coffee shop, your living room. We essentially sell productive by the hour. We now have 9 locations in DC, or will at the end of this month, and we launched about a year and a few months ago. So we've been growing throughout the district, and yeah, excited to be here.
Cool. And I'm Steve Lucas. Many of you probably thought Johan was going to be on the call today. As you can imagine, the winter weather has made it difficult for people to make their flights. But my name is Steve Lucas. I'm one of the other founders of EquityEats. There's 4 of us. And my role on the team is the VP of Strategy and Communication. So I do a lot of work with media. I build a lot of our partnerships within the community, work with people in the food and beverage industry, and also crowdfunding and tech. And I'm glad to be on this panel today.
Great. Hey, and I'm Adam Thierer. I'm going to be moderating today's discussion. I want to welcome everybody to the show. I am a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, where I research technology policy issues with an eye towards emerging technology issues in particular. And the sharing economy is something that I've spent a lot of time writing about recently, including a big new paper that you can find on the Mercatus.org site on these issues. But again, on behalf of Digital District, I want to welcome everybody to the discussion today on accessing the sharing economy and the various types of opportunities associated with this constantly expanding world of different types of services and applications that provide consumers with convenient and cost-effective access to a wide variety of resources that they perhaps previously did not have access to. We're going to be talking a little bit about how we can expand those opportunities, the unique opportunities potentially that exist within the District of Columbia, and the kind of things that have been happening in this area over the last couple of years on this front. And then also talk about future opportunities or potentially even future threats that are out there that we need to be looking at, both from a business perspective, investment perspective, and even a policy or regulatory perspective. So I figured I'd kick it off with just a general question to Adam and Steve, and then hopefully if Gabe gets on the line, we'll ask him too, to sort of just talk to us about the sort of unique value and opportunities that are being created by the sharing economy, specifically with your own companies, but also with other companies or organizations that you're aware of, and how specifically this is playing out in the District of Columbia right now. Let's start with you, Steve.
Sure. And so I realized that I didn't really explain what EquityEats was, and I think it'll probably help to put this in perspective. So EquityEats is essentially an equity crowdfunding platform for restaurants, bars, coffee shops, anything brick and mortar in the food and beverage industry. And what we're trying to do is transform the industry in people's communities through crowdfunding. What we've seen in the district is, the district is in some ways becoming a leader in equity crowdfunding. Platforms like Fundrise paved the way in commercial real estate. We actually just completed our first raise here in DC, thanks to the DC government's passage of an interstate crowdfunding exemption law. What that allowed people to do was invest as much money as they wanted to, as little as $100, and as much, in our case, as much as $10,000 in an offering. And what that means in terms of the past is that previously only people who are accredited investors, so people who made 6-figure incomes or had over a net worth over $1 million, could invest in these kind of opportunities. And what the DC government's actions, and there's 14 other states that have done this as well, what these states have allowed entrepreneurs to do is raise capital from communities, from every DC resident at any income level. And so for entrepreneurs, that gives them access to capital they didn't have before. And then for investors, it's really turning turning around people's notion of what is an investor. When you would say, we're looking for investors for this opportunity, someone like me who was working previously, as a consultant, I wouldn't have necessarily thought I was an investor because I didn't have a portfolio. I wasn't really steeped in the literature, the business literature. But now that I could invest in something through crowdfunding, it's really kind of changing people's perception of what an investor is. So for EquityEats, the benefit of the sharing economy is that we're allowing more entrepreneurs more access to capital, and then more people, be them investors or beginning investors, access to opportunities to build their community.
Great. Adam Segal, let me bring you in on that same question and have you talk about, obviously what Cove does in this space, but also the broader opportunities that exist here.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think DC specific, essentially any urban environment is a sandbox for the shared economy to be effective. When you have a lot of density of people, you have things like Zipcar, you have things like Lyft, you have things like Uber, obviously. Once you put a lot of people together, there's a bigger marketplace. So I think DC is a good environment for that, namely because, and this is why I specifically started Cove here, is because of all these different neighborhoods. So not only are you bringing everyone together in an urban environment, but there's pockets. So you not only can test different things, figure out what works, figure out what types of things, what types of environments work better for different type of people, but you do it all within one city itself. And I think DC is somewhat particular like that, relative to obviously New York, has a ton of different neighborhoods, but DC is also very international and also adds element, which obviously New York has, but just in a very different way. So I think for Cove, I was coming from Boston. We specifically came here to start here basically because of that environment, because of that very particular user base, and how Cove specifically relates to the shared economy. We are essentially, when I sit down at this desk that I'm actually at Cove right now, when I get up, someone else is going to be sitting there as well. So the shared resource, it's not only a shared resource, you're using the same resource. Just like when you get in and out of a Lyft or out of an Uber, you're going to sit in that same seat. So I think DC in particular, I can't speak as much to the governmental environment, but I think just from a market perspective, it has a lot of elements that are very unique to this city.
Well, that's good, because that transitions nicely to my next question, which is perhaps not everybody watching the Hangout is familiar with exactly what's happened in DC in recent years on this front. Maybe you could answer one of two questions or both for me, guys. First of all, what were the specific changes in the regulatory or policy environment that might have helped incentivize some of these developments in the sharing economy, both for your companies and others? And then more generally, a question about how DC stacks up to other municipal areas or state and local areas in terms of investment environment, regulatory environment, perhaps just talking a little bit about where else you're active and how DC stacks up relative to those other environments.
I could probably take a stab at that, since the regulatory burden for a company in equity crowdfunding is actually pretty significant. People think of Kickstarter and Indiegogo when it comes to crowdfunding, but rapidly you're going to see that changing because the 2012 Jobs Act allowed equity crowdfunding in place of just rewards-based crowdfunding. So people give $100 and they get gifts; they don't necessarily get equity. And in 2012, both chambers of Congress passed the Jobs Act and allowed this to happen. One of the few bipartisan bills that year. And the SEC was charged with, proposing and finalizing rules to govern this law. And it's been years since that the law was passed. We've seen rules come out from the SEC in late 2013. We're still waiting on the final rules. It looks like it's going to be the end of 2015. So I'll say at the federal level, crowdfunding has been very exciting, but it's very difficult from a business development perspective because you have to be aware of what's going on at the federal level and at the state level, and also how that connects with the local culture. That's all to say that we actually decided to start the company here. We looked at other tech hubs, San Francisco, Seattle. We even looked at LA and Austin. We actually stayed in DC. in large part because of the food culture here and the type of food and beverage community it is. We're not a San Francisco yet, we're not a New York yet necessarily, but the community of people that were going to be interested in investing in new restaurants was here in DC. And so we decided to start here. And at first, you know, from day one, we always wanted to do what I call all-access equity crowdfunding. All-access meaning it's not just accredited investors, but everyone in the community. And you know, we were working from that vantage point, you know, from the very beginning. But by the end of last summer, we had to make a decision if we were going to wait on the Jobs Act regulations coming out from the SEC, or if we were going to operate in the existing regulatory environment. And we had to make the decision then to go to market with only accredited investor offerings. And you know, we had some foreseeable challenges there because you're raising money from a group of people that have already had access to these investments. But it was really good to get feedback from people about the model and learn from those initial offerings, you know, how we needed to quickly pivot and iterate, you know, our model. And thankfully, DC continued to be our home last year when they passed the crowdfunding exemption laws that would allow us to do the kind of crowdfunding that we wanted to do. We were the first company to get approved by the DC government here in early 2015, and in the last month we've raised $200,000 from over 330 investors that are DC residents. So for us, the regulatory landscape has been very crucial to our business development, but we've learned to adapt in face of uncertainty.
Okay. Adam, let me come to you with the same question and specifically just reiterate how you think perhaps DC stacks up against other communities or municipalities.
Yeah, for us, we're not, our shared resources and capital, so we have definitely a different perspective. I think, to be honest, from a perspective of regulation being in DC, because if you want to access the DC market, you're also going to want to access the Virginia market and the Maryland market. So to be honest, I think it actually makes it more difficult to operate from a government perspective in terms of, I know for us, we have to file not only in DC, but Virginia, and now we're going to soon be opening in Maryland, and it just adds definitely a new layer, whereas if we were in one city, we'd only have to focus on understanding, or if we had launched in one city, we don't have to understand that environment. So I think in order to get off the ground in DC, it's the same, but if you want to expand fairly rapidly, there's definitely a new layer and barrier that you wouldn't otherwise face relative to a different market.
And we see that too. So the law that was passed here in the DC government, it only affects DC residents. And so we aren't able to take investments for a DC-based offering from Virginia residents or Maryland residents, which, as we all know, this metro area is so connected to those other two states that makes it difficult. But recently we've gotten good news that Virginia is going to allow a crowdfunding exemption in Virginia, but that's only for Virginia-based businesses with Virginia investors. So it's still keeping DC and Virginia separate.
Well, that's interesting. Let me ask a follow-up based on that, because I've been familiar with these sorts of unique challenges posed by our municipal area for the reasons you guys both identified of people wanting to do business in not just DC, but obviously Northern Virginia and then Maryland and the various issues there. Is there any effort by policymakers in this area or regulators to try to work together to find a way to harmonize or find a way to make it easier for investors and entrepreneurs to do sharing economy type innovation, or is that just not happening?
Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit. I think the biggest thing we've seen is in terms of reciprocity of state taxes, and that's just universal to doing business in district, irrespective of startup or shared economy, in the sense that it carries over between the three states, so you don't have to worry about if you have employees coming from different places. And to be honest, that adds significant value. I think outside of that, from my perspective, I don't see governments necessarily working together to, I think each individual government has its own agendas, for better and for worse. And so I think from a sharing perspective, I haven't specifically seen that. But I don't want to say that relative to the sharing economy, because I think it's just more to a startup environment, because each individual city wants you obviously to start a business there and to grow and expand there. It means more employees, more tax dollars. But I think from in terms of the benefits, in terms of how that all comes together. I think it's more for the individual, i.e. us as a startup, to navigate that world, lest the government's coming together kind of on a united front.
Steve, anything on that point?
So I think two things here. One, the governments in the DC metro area here, they have previously worked together when it came to crowdfunding. I think Fundrise would probably have a better story about that, because they went through a process that was existing that would allow these three governments to work together for an offering. That wasn't workable for us for a couple of reasons. And in our case, in the current landscape, with these exemptions allowing equity crowdfunding, DC and Virginia are operating separately right now, but all of the states are waiting for the federal laws to be finalized. So they're waiting for the SEC to take action, because that will federalize equity crowdfunding. And so we see the opportunity, getting to market and really refining our model, collecting data quickly to learn about people's appetite for and their behaviors around equity crowdfunding now in these exemption states. And then once the SEC does take action on Title III, we'll see how workable Title III is from our standpoint, and then also how we need to sort of scale in multiple cities.
Okay. Are there some barriers that we haven't identified here that we should be making our viewers aware of? We're talking about barriers to finding new investors and launching services. Are there other types of concerns? I mean, perhaps tax concerns, labor market concerns, other things that investors need to be aware of?
Yeah, I think, Adam, to answer your question, I think from my perspective, we've gone more of a traditional route in the sense that we had seed investors and we have venture backing. And to be honest, those didn't come from this area. They came from Boston and San Francisco. So I wouldn't say that from my perspective, the DC market isn't necessarily ripe for consumer-facing products. And consumer-facing products are largely shared economy. You think of Lyft, you think of Uber. These are all things that are B2C, not B2B. So I think there's also that systemic to the type of environment DC is, i.e. it's very government-oriented, it's a lot of consultants, these types of things that don't necessarily migrate to consumer-facing products. So I think from my perspective, someone who is working on a consumer-facing brand, it's not necessarily ripe from an investor perspective, and I think that's just more systemic to the type of area we're in.
Okay.
I think for us, one thing I point to that's a barrier as a tech startup in DC, for instance, is that we don't have the developed infrastructure as a tech community that other cities do. The other side of that, though, is if you're in a Seattle, if you're in a San Francisco, you're competing with hundreds or thousands of other people for attention. What we like about DC is that it is growing, just like the food community is, the tech community is. And EquityEats position between those two, we would like other food tech companies to see us as an ally and to work with us. We're opening a space in Penn Quarter that's going to be a restaurant pop-up complex called Prequel. And Prequel is the crowdfunded project that we did. But in that space, we've told people that are in the food tech space, feel free to come and hang out, work there. We're not trying to compete with Cove. But we're just saying,
I'm hearing.
Or there's something maybe we can do together.
Sure.
I think part of being a startup is that you do have to share your resources. Just like you don't want to always be asking for things. That's always like the classic give more than you take. But I think that's one of the barriers for tech companies is that we don't have necessarily the infrastructure here, the venture funds, the large number of angel investors that a startup would need. But I think in terms of customers and the general public's appetite for the product, it's there. We thought that we would get a lot of interest in Prequel when we did our first all-access crowdfunding raise, but we didn't anticipate how quickly that would happen. And we finished our raise well before the end of the month.
Well, that's interesting because I had a follow-up question about if DC was getting on the radar of venture capitalists and angel investors and other communities, and whether or not they were finding it to be a more inviting and hospitable environment to be sinking their resources or investments into. Because for a long time, I don't think that was the case, but it certainly seems like we've turned an important corner here, don't you think? Or am I wrong about that?
I mean, I don't know what Adam's thoughts are on this, but I think, you know, for us, we have a mix of, you know, we've been primarily financed by angel investors, whether here in the DC area or we have people that support us out in Boulder. Because Johan's second startup was out in Boulder. He was part of the inaugural class of Techstars, so you know he was part of that tech corridor, if you will, for a while. But I think because of the internet and because everyone is so interconnected, there's not necessarily too many barriers when it comes, you know, to funding. But it is different having a flag in a city versus, trying to cultivate attention. And so I think from a fundraising standpoint, it could be difficult if you aren't in those established cities to do this. But for us, you know, we've been able to overcome those challenges pretty quickly.
Okay, Adam, anything on that?
Yeah, definitely. I think what's interesting about, if you think about an investor's perspective, i.e. like an angel investor, even a venture investor, they want to be able to feel like they're adding value. So if you're in an environment where people don't come from a startup background or they aren't doing consumer-facing brands, to my earlier point, they're not going to feel like they're adding value in a startup by investing in them. Because, for example, for us at Cove, the big value we garner from our investors is the support they provide us. Obviously, the dollars are extremely important, but what's even more important is the benefits of their previous experience and how they can value that and leverage that for Cove. So I think when you don't have that background, you're less inclined to participate in a startup from a money perspective. And I think on the flip side, from an individual startup, it's not the same value add you're going to get from someone who's done it before. So I think to your point, have we turned a corner? I think until there's like a larger ecosystem of people that have done startups or been in this type of space and then progressed, i.e. if there was a big output from Living Social or some other, like I guess AOL is a good example, then you're going to create this environment where people feel like they're adding value and start to invest and have that angel perspective where they can add value.
Okay. Well, in light of what you guys both just said about that, and then earlier about some of the continuing policy concerns that are out there, what advice would you give to either those that are watching us now or just other folks that are entrepreneurial and looking to get more involved in this space, specifically in DC and sharing economy opportunities? I'm not asking you to give away any business secrets here or anything, but obviously there's probably some general advice you could give to people who are trying to do what you guys have already done. Let's start with you, Adam.
Sure. Sure. Yeah, no, I think the first thing you can do is you probably want to be productive, so you may want to stop by a Cove. It's a little product placement. But I think in general it's just talking to as many people as possible. That's the first thing I did when I was getting started, was understanding the environment, understanding the market, really just understanding who has done it before and what they did in their steps. And I think that's specific to any environment, any city, but also even specific to the type of startup or the type of challenge you're going to try to solve. So I think for DC, it would be, I think Steve mentioned earlier, but in terms of tapping into that startup environment, that startup scene, going to the meetups, going to any type of things like this where you can actually hear about different experiences and finding others that are doing similar things. So I think, and then specifically to answer your question on sharing economy, I think DC has so many different examples of sharing economy, especially with Uber's hub being here and and Lyft's got a big office here, that if you actually wanted to work at one of these places, you get a good insight into how things operate, as well as Cove.
That's great. Steve?
So you're thinking like advice, you know, to people that are in this space. It sounds really simple, but build a team. You know, like really connect with the right people from the very beginning. It's going to be much easier to face any of these challenges, whether that be funding, your location, changing your model, adapting to the regulatory environment, if you have the right team. We've built our team slowly. You know, at first it was like 3 of us working in a condo, you know, for months on end, and it was because, you know, the 3 of us were really strong in what we saw and what we wanted to build, and adapted very quickly, that we were able to do this. It's a lot easier when you have a team, because I meet a lot of people who are individuals who want to get involved with us. or they're individuals who want to build their own company. And I admire the passion individually, but even just bringing one other person into that idea and convincing them that it's the right idea is going to be a huge test for you as an entrepreneur. It's going to be a huge test of the idea, and your idea is going to improve as you find the right people to connect around it. And so if you're going to go for funding and you're a solo entrepreneur, it's going to be much harder and versus having a team of 2 or 3 people who say, hey, this is what we're going to build. This is how we vetted the idea. So I say you have to start with the right people, and it can be people in your network whose opinion or their intellect or their creativity you trust. Our background as a team is varied. We have tech, we have hospitality, we have healthcare, we have legal, we have, all sorts of things in our backgrounds. But what we all sort of committed to is this is a great vision that we can build out with all of these different skills with these networks. So I would say, build the internal team first.
That's great. That's good advice. Well, I've just got one more question, then I think we're getting close to the end of our time. I'm going to ask you something that a question that often gets put to me when I'm talking to policymakers and the press about the sharing economy and future opportunities, which is I get the question basically of, what's the limit? Is the sky the limit here, or is this just a big city phenomenon? We're talking about D.C. and what's happening here and in Boston and New York and San Francisco. But I talk to a lot of policymakers who aren't from D.C. or any big city. They're from maybe rural states, and they're wondering, well, when does this exciting sharing economy revolution spread to my neighborhood? And I tell them, well, with time, I think the sky is the limit. I mean, there's potentially a great amount of opportunity, but it may be a slow spread. What do you guys think about that, or how would you advise that we answer that question, whether it's the press or policymakers asking it? Adam?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think a startup is going to go where there's the most opportunity, right? And to your point, an urban environment is going to be the best opportunity because you have so many more consumers where you can get feedback and iterate and start to learn what works and what doesn't. But I think to your point, and in some ways, although it's going to be a longer process to get to less dense, more rural environments, in a lot of ways you're going to get a better product once you get there because it's going to be tried and tested once you're in these urban settings and they've worked through all these kinks. So that by the time in, let's say, 2 or 3 years, where it's actually migrated out, the product's going to be, I guarantee you, 95% better than the original product that was first launched. So I think in some ways that is a benefit. And so although it's going to take some time, you're actually going to get the benefits of everything that came before of it.
That's a good point. Steve, anything on that?
Yeah, I think what excites me most about equity crowdfunding is not necessarily that restaurants are going to open here in Washington, D.C., or in other major cities. It's when, I'm from Western Pennsylvania, whenever a community in Western Pennsylvania is able to build their own independent, sustainably financed restaurants, that is going to be when equity crowdfunding really disrupts the economic environment for restaurateurs and other small business owners, is that communities can use the capital that they share and build better businesses, build more profitable businesses. You're going to have, if you're in a smaller town, the social networks are very, very strong. In a large city like DC, you have to kind of pitch the idea, but let's say you have one entrepreneur in a smaller town or even just a suburb. They can build, a coalition around that idea within any community. You've seen this in political campaigns. You've seen this in rewards-based crowdfunding, that when people want to support an idea, they can make it happen. With equity crowdfunding, it is a new way of, from a business standpoint, of building and keeping open these businesses. So I think for us, it's just a matter of time where our entrepreneurs on our platform are going to build, a restaurant in rural Iowa, in Nevada, Idaho. That's, for us, what's going to be really exciting about the future of crowdfunding is that when we can oversee that, we've done something pretty significant.
Well, that's great. That's very cool. It's a good note to, I think, end on. And unless Elliot of Digital District has anything else he wants to add on this, I think we're probably about to the end of our time. Elliot, anything more?
No, actually, that was just a fantastic panel. So I wanted to thank Adam, and Steve for joining us. It was a great and informative session. We will be posting this recording on our site, sharing it across all of our feeds. And of course, any kind of information about what you guys do, obviously, Adam, a lot of your awesome published work, we'll be posting links to that as well. So yeah, just again, thank you so much for joining us, and we will definitely be in touch with you guys for future stuff.
Cool.
Thank you.
Thanks, Elliot.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for those of you who were joining us today.